Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Mark Batson. I'm the Executive Director of Policy Bridge, and Policy Bridge is a public policy think tank focused on addressing public policy issues, and particularly those of importance to the African American community. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we'll be hearing from Dr. Alan Curtis, CEO and President of the Milton S. Eisenhower Foundation. The Eisenhower Foundation in Washington, D.C., its mission is patriotism, democracy, and common sense, restoring America's promise at home and abroad. The foundation continues the work of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, also known as the Kerner Riot Commission, and the National Commission for the Cause and Prevention of Violence. The Eisenhower Foundation models programs for youth development, crime prevention, public school reform, dropout prevention, high school dropout prevention, workforce development, and prisoner reentry. Today we were having a discussion earlier about the nature of his foundation and the fact that he's been doing a 40-year update on the Kerner Commission. And I was struck by some of the stories that we were discussing around the riots of some 40 years ago, and thinking of my own experience, having grown up on the east side of Cleveland, and I've told a story that, you know, when I was a kid, you would ride around some of those neighborhoods and they would be lit up like a Christmas tree, even in the summertime. But since the riots, I never have seen those neighborhoods look quite like that, like they were when I was a kid. So obviously, you know, the work that we're doing around in the aftermath of the riots, it continues, and in some cases has mounted and has presented even greater challenges. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that today from Dr. Curtis. He has a BA in economics from Harvard University, a master's in economics from the University of London, and a Ph.D. in urban studies and criminology from the University of Pennsylvania. He has authored several books and is a former urban policy advisor or director within the Carter administration. He currently is the CEO and president of the Eisenhower Foundation in Washington, D.C., and has been a staunch advocate of public policies that advocate for change in urban communities around the country. Please welcome Dr. Alan Curtis.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark, and Randy and Policy Bridge for this opportunity, and to Jim and the City Club. I'm honored to be allowed to be with you this afternoon. I want to thank all the sponsors of this, the Center for Families and Children, the Office of Minority Health, the city, the NAACP, Council for Economic Opportunities, the Neighborhood Leadership Institute, and Youth Opportunities Unlimited. I really appreciate your partnership today. I know it's March Madness, but I've been watching the World Baseball Classic, and Japan won, and their famous Japanese player Ichiro hit a single in the 10th inning. And afterwards, they had the press conference, but Ichiro had his own way of doing things, and he didn't meet the press immediately. He went and took a shower, took off his uniform, took a shower, and then what he did is, instead of putting on city clothes, he put on his uniform again, a fresh uniform. And he did that to show that he was part of the team, not an individual in city clothes, but a part of Team Japan. And so I want to talk a little about we're all in this together and teamwork today. Rahm Emanuel says we should never let a good or bad crisis go to waste, and I want to talk about how the current state of affairs can be used in the long run. I flew in last night from Milwaukee, where I grew up, went to Pulaski High School. Visiting my mom, who's 93, and she still drives the 1980 Buick. Tough mom. I left my daughter there, my 11-year-old daughter, so I asked my mom not to drive my daughter around town. But anyway, they're gonna do some bonding while I am doing some other things. And I want to talk about cities like Milwaukee and Cleveland and Detroit this afternoon. As Mark said, the foundation is the private sector continuation of the Kerner Commission after the urban rebellions in the mid-'60s and the National Violence Commission, which was formed after the assassinations of Reverend King and Senator Kennedy, both commissions of President Johnson. We periodically issue updates of those commissions to remind Americans who often have short memories about what happened then and what's happened since. And last year, we issued a 40-year update of the Kerner Commission, which issued its report in 1968. And I'd like to talk briefly today about what we said. It was billed as a preliminary report, and we wanted to make that clear to everyone because we planned to have forums around the nation, as this one, to get feedback on our preliminary findings, which are posted on our website, so that eventually we'll come out with a report that is ennobled and has the wisdom of people from around the country. So this is an important setting for us, and your questions will find their way into our final report. We could do more things. We're planning with Wayne State and Detroit to have a national conference in which we invite the Obama people to discuss the same themes that I want to talk about today, which are essentially the Obama vision and the priorities of the Kerner Commission. So if there's any interest in Cleveland, we would be certainly interested in trying to do a national forum along the lines of what we're planning with Wayne State and perhaps with Policy Bridge. At any rate, what I'd like to do is talk a little about trends since the Kerner Commission issued its report in 1968, about the policy that follows from those trends and about the political will that's needed to enact that policy. And I'll certainly, keeping an eye on what's happening now in the immediate crises, but I want to talk more about the long run and the movement and the issues that were raised originally by the Kerner Commission and may have to be set aside a little during these months by the President, but hopefully will be addressed by the President. So trends since the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission talked about poverty, about inequality, about racial injustice, about crime, and about lack of media diversity. And what can we say very broadly about those themes over the last 40 years plus since the Kerner Commission issued its findings? Well, child poverty today is actually higher than in 1968. And it's over 20%, well over 20% now and growing. The child poverty rate in America is 4 times higher than the average child poverty rate of countries in Europe. We haven't made that much progress in terms of reducing poverty when you take a 40-year span. What about inequality? We're just about the most unequal country in the industrialized world in terms of income inequality. We are the most unequal country in terms of wealth inequality. And we have a huge gap when it comes to wage inequality. Back at the time of the Kerner Commission in the 60s, CEOs made 40 times as much as their workers. Today they make 275 times as much as their workers. And it seems to take an AIG kind of media flurry to remind people of that huge gap and those inequalities in terms of wages. That's certainly related to unemployment, which is, of course, going up and is linked in turn to poverty for the nation as a whole. But over the 40 years since the Kerner Commission, the historical gap, 2-to-1 gap between African American and white unemployment has been maintained all through those years across Republican and Democratic presidents. African American rate is always twice as high. Today, a 19-year-old high school dropout, an African American man in a city, now people in that status have an unemployment rate of over 62%, and that is growing. So we haven't made much progress in many ways in terms of employment and race. When it comes to racial injustice, we made progress in terms of school desegregation, for example, after the Kerner Commission. But when it came to the Reagan years, that was reversed, and the 2007 Seattle Supreme Court decision effectively stopped all school desegregation opportunities, and certainly our neighborhoods are still highly segregated. In terms of media diversity, well, we do have the internet, and there's some potential there as long as Comcast doesn't control the media content too much. But there are only 5 or 6 or 7 giant companies controlled by whites who have control of almost all of the media, and the amount of minority ownership of the media is minuscule. And if you take a look at a press conference, there's President Obama standing there, but how many of the people in the audience are African American and Latino or Native American? There's huge disparities there, and they remain maintained to this day. So there hasn't been much progress made in many areas, all of the ones I suggested. One can say that the experience, the trends are not positive, and in many cases negative. Now, certainly there are counter trends. There are good things that have happened in the last 40 years. The African American and Latino middle class has expanded dramatically as African American and Latino entrepreneurship, and the number of African Americans and Latinos who are locally elected officials, of course, is skyrocketed. And the best story is, of course, that we actually did it last fall. We elected an African American president, and so those are good trends, and they suggest hope. The question is, given that hope, how much can be achieved in the next 4 and 8 years by the president, given the fact that he's been dug into a hole by the previous administrations and has to face all these immediate crises, and has to deal with the day-to-day issues of toxic assets, while hopefully he deals with long-run policy. I want to talk a little about how long-run policy, though, and the policy that we recommended in our Kerner update. We, as the original Kerner Commission, gave first priority to employment and education policy. And we stressed that what we need to do today is target that policy on the middle class and on the working class and on the truly disadvantaged equally, so that they all have a stake in the process, and so that not only do they benefit, but that we have the potential for a political coalition in the future, because they have in fact benefited. By employment policy, we mean strengthening the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act, which essentially says that once there is 4% unemployment, a process goes into effect whereby we do something about it. And now I'm not talking about the immediate situation today where employment is so high, but just year to year, decade to decade, whenever unemployment gets above 4%, we should have a Keynesian-like process of countering it. I'm talking about the Employee Free Choice Act. We need to make it easier for people, for employees to join unions. I'm talking about universal health care, which is needed in and of itself for all Americans, but is certainly a policy that strengthens workers and gives them more flexibility in their day-to-day life. I'm talking about new trade policy, which gives more rights to workers, gives workers as much rights as stockholders, and that keeps jobs in America. And most of all, I'm talking about a new employment, training, and creation program that replaces the Workforce Investment Act and TANF that really links training and retraining of the poor, working class, and middle class to jobs that are in demand wherever they're in demand. And this can be modeled in part on the successful experiences of countries in Europe, like Germany and some of the Scandinavian countries, but also the successful experiences of a number of American organizations and states, like the Center for Employment Training in California. But we need a comprehensive system where if you're out of work, you get trained, retrained, and you get directed to a place where there is a job with upward mobility. Linked to this employment strategy is an education strategy, and we're calling for an Education Equity Act. And the main goal of that act should be to ensure that every kid in every school district across the country has the same amount invested in them as adjusted for local cost of living. Almost I think every industrialized democracy now has such a policy. Regardless of where you live and what school district, the same amount gets invested in you in terms of the teachers and the classroom size and the facilities and the computers and all of what you know better than I is needed. There are states that have made good progress towards a greater equity, states like Connecticut and the state of North Carolina, and we should build on that in what we do. And we should have, as part of an Educational Equity Act, a contract for college where we go back more to a grant system rather than the present loan system. These are just some of the examples that we're talking about that cut across all levels in the country, at least the middle class, the working class, and the poor, and that can help pull them together into a coalition for the future. But we also think that there needs to be a simultaneous, concentrated strategy targeted at the areas of greatest need in our inner cities and for the truly disadvantaged. And here what's really important is to remember that since the Kerner Commission, we've learned a great deal through scientific evaluations and best practices about what doesn't work, and we've learned a great deal about what does work for the inner city. And so it would make sense, at least to me, to stop doing what doesn't work and start doing what does work, but at a scale equal to the dimensions of the problem, to quote the Kerner Commission. But I don't have to quote the Kerner Commission, or just the Kerner Commission anymore, because look at the President's inaugural address. He says we need to stop doing what doesn't work, and we need to invest in what does work. He talks about what works all the time. And we feel excited that the President has taken this theme, and we hope to continue to work with the administration on this theme. What do I mean by what doesn't work and what does work, very briefly, when you're focused on the truly disadvantaged? Well, what doesn't work? We know that supply-side, trickle-down voodoo economics and deregulation don't quite work. I think most Americans have sufficient evidence now that that's that's the case, certainly for the poor, but for everyone else. But we also know that prison building hasn't worked. One of the goals of the Kerner Commission was to reduce crime, and when you look at crime in the 60s compared to now, you see that the most serious crime, best reported crime, homicide, is at about the same rate as it was in the 60s. 40 years later, it's about the same rate, in spite of the fact that we've had an 8-fold increase in the prison population. So we have 2 million people in prison. And what is prison? I mean, we now have a prison industrial complex, which is racially biased and which is basically an economic development program for rural white communities, which get all the prisons. And they sort of sweep folks out of the inner city and put them in these rural white areas. So prison building hasn't worked, certainly for folks in the inner city. It's worked for people who run private sector prisons, of course, and they are pushing to try to keep those prisons full. We know that boot camps don't work, that enterprise zones never worked and were very oversold. And we also know that certain buzzwords need to be treated carefully. I'm talking about words like empowerment, self-sufficiency, volunteerism, and even faith-based. Now, I'm not really, I use those words all the time, and we in our programs, we fund programs in inner cities. We follow these concepts. But what I'm simply saying this afternoon is that beware of these words being abused politically. Beware of them being blue smoke and mirrors for the lack of investment, social and economic investment in the places that need it the most. I mean, when we go to Iraq, when we go to Afghanistan, we pay people who are the personnel, and we buy a lot of equipment for them, and we invest in that in a long period of time. But for the inner city, of course, we're supposed to sort of get a $60,000 one-year grant from the Justice Department, and then we're supposed to leverage that against bake sale money and get a lot of volunteers who are not adequately trained, and through that process, the community gets empowered and everyone is self-sufficient. Well, okay, I think there's a bit of a double standard in terms of how we spend militarily versus how we spend in the inner city. So much for what, just a few examples of what doesn't work. It's more fun to talk about what does work. Head Start works. You all know that, and it's 40 years of evaluation on that. After school safe havens where kids come for help with homework, for some food, for some mentoring work, plenty of evaluations. For middle school kids, full-service community schools are good examples. So is the Comer School Development Plan. Our trustee, Jim Comer at Yale, has been doing this all his life. For high schoolers, one of the most successful programs is something we replicate. It's called Quantum Opportunities. Basically, it's an online learning system where typically kids in inner cities come into 9th grade, reading at 5th grade and doing math at 5th grade level. And they can just go online and they can start at their current level, and then they can work up very quickly online with an adult mentor and away from their friends who are telling them it's not cool to learn. For dropouts, for people who do drop out of school, there are plenty of successful programs that get them GEDs and get them good job training, like Youth Build USA. And this is the same thing for people who not only drop out, but are in the prison system. There are plenty of reintegration programs like the Gemeinschaft Home in Virginia, which we are replicating, like the work of the Safer Foundation. These are and more are evaluated programs which have shown success and just need the resources to replicate to scale. We know that in the inner city, many community development corporations are promoting economic development in a moral and a wise economic way, and that they're often financed by community-based banking, a la South Shore Bank. And we know that much of this can be helped by community-based, problem-oriented policing, not zero-tolerance policing, but policing in which the officers are really with the neighborhood residents and are respected by the neighborhood residents. So those are just a few examples. Just take a step back and think about how just those few examples, and there are many more, interrelate. I mean, if you begin with community-based problem-oriented policing in a specified neighborhood, you can secure the neighborhood to help community-based banking, which can generate economic development through CDCs, which can employ people in programs like Youth Build. Similarly, you can get kids through high school if they've been in programs like Quantum, and they can get that far if they've, in middle school, been in full-service community schools and Comer schools, and they can get that far if in primary school they've been in Safe Havens, and they can get that far if they've been in Head Start preschool. And so, following the President's words in the inaugural address, if you ask what works in America since the Kerner Commission, based on scientific evaluation, the answer is not narrow and categorical program. The answer is comprehensive and interdependent. The answer is multiple solutions to multiple problems, to use the words of Elizabeth Shore at Harvard School of Public Health. And so that's why we have been recommending in our Kerner updates and other publications that the Obama administration embark on a series of safe haven investment neighborhoods where all of these multiple solutions and many more, like, for example, the work of Geoffrey Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone, are integrated together and can interact with one another and really serve as social and economic investments that work for those specific neighborhoods. Complementary to that, we need to get back on the path of racial desegregation. The President is going to be able to make some choices on the Supreme Court, and that, I think, can start the process. But simultaneously, there are many good programs for residential reintegration, like the Gautreaux program begun in Chicago, which need to be replicated on a broader scale. I will just leave with those examples. You can give me many, many more, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about ideas that need to be replicated in the future. But I want to conclude with a few observations on political will. The Kerner Commission made the kind of recommendations I have just laid out, but said they would never be enacted without, quote, new will. The country needed to change its attitude to implement these kinds of programs. Well, what happened? The Kerner Commission came out in March of 1968. Dr. King, and we have it on some of our DVDs, endorsed the Kerner Commission and talked, reflected on it. And in April, he was assassinated. With that assassination, we ended all hope for the immediate future of changing political will in America. But it was even worse than that, because in the 60s, something else started to happen. Barry Goldwater got defeated in 1964. I was working as the Southside Voter Registration Headquarters in Milwaukee, so I was rewarded by a barbecue. I was working for President Johnson, so I was awarded the reward for beating Goldwater was that we got to go to a barbecue with Lucy Johnson in Madison. And that was okay, but we didn't know what was going to happen, and that was people who were for Goldwater were very upset and thought the liberal media were not being fair to them and that there needed to be a new conservative movement. And they got together, people and foundations. And I'm talking about names like Bradley and Mellon and Scaife and Coors. Now, I never drink Coors beer. They said, let's finance a long-term movement that takes America to a more conservative place, and let's bankroll it. They observed that then in the 60s there were less than 10 conservative think tanks in Washington, D.C., and they thought something should be done about it. And so over the decades they invested, and now there are over 300 conservative think tanks in Washington, D.C. And they also created the likes of Fox television. And they also created the likes of talk radio and Rush Limbaugh, who during the campaign called the president that little black man-child. They did a lot of other things, but they certainly prepared America for 1980. They provided the setting, the intellectual setting, the political setting for the victory of Ronald Reagan. That's a reality. That's what happened. Instead of the new will that could have been possible that the Kerner Commission talked about, we got America being taken to a conservative place that allowed the likes of the policies of the 1980s and the policies of this new millennium to take place. And the issue, therefore, now is to how to take America to a much better place. The Obama people are, of course, savvy, and I'm on their 10 million member email list. I assume most of you are, and David Plouffe writes, he sends me something every other day. And it was certainly a campaign strategy, but it's as you know, it's now beyond the campaign, and it's let's get the stimulus package passed, and then let's get on with the movement. And that's brilliant. And we have to work with them, because that's the source of the long-run movement that's got to take America to a different place, and a movement that has to neutralize the conservative movement. And remember, the conservative movement is still there. I mean, they're sort of having a few fights among themselves, but you read and you see what they're saying. They still believe in voodoo economics. They still believe in trickle-down. They still believe in deregulation. It's all there. They're going to take a few months or a few years off, go to the Bahamas, have a rest, reorganize, and they're going to be coming back. And so, we got to be smarter, and we have to have our own long-run movement that starts now with the crisis, but then moves on to the long-run Obama vision and to the long-run vision of the Kerner Commission. We in the private nonprofit sector, I suggest to you, need to work as partners with the Obama administration. They initiate a lot, but we should initiate a lot on our own in terms of creating a new movement. In our update of the Kerner Commission, we call for a fair economic deal. That's the name that we give to the movement. You can give it whatever name you want. There are a lot of nonprofits talking about what to do. And the fair economic deal, as we see it, has to begin with policy for the middle class, the working class, and the poor, as I articulated, for employment and education, that not only helps them people, but serves to pull them together as a long-term voting coalition. So it's both a substantive strategy and a political strategy that has to be the point of origin of a fair economic deal. But we have to pay attention to the words and to the narrative, because the conservatives have their own narrative. It's the Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Ronald Reagan narrative. We have to have our own narrative that weaves the priorities of the Kerner Commission, the vision of President Obama, with the positions and the policies of especially four American presidents: Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and John Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln had a pretty good policy on racial justice, but he also invested in the federal land grant system and colleges, and he invested in public infrastructure, and that's a good model to build on. Teddy Roosevelt said, okay, I'm speaking softly, sometimes not so softly, and carrying a big stick against who? Against Wall Street, against the greed of Wall Street. It was there, it was over 100 years ago, but he was saying the same thing that a lot of folks are saying today, and we need that spirit of Teddy Roosevelt to say that what Wall Street thinks is important is not what Main Street necessarily thinks is important. We need Franklin Roosevelt's sense of a social contract, and we need to remember that he employed Keynesian policy to create an economic stimulus. He didn't continue the stimulus long enough, and then the war had to take over to provide the ultimate stimulus. But he had the Keynesian economic policy that we need today. And of course, John F. Kennedy asked what we could do for our country and talked about how we are all in this together. And so those presidents and their ideas need to be discussed and woven into books and presentations and policy reports and the whole fabric of the discussion that, of course, gets picked up immediately and distorted by the media. We have to work on that narrative, on that story, and make it an American story, a story for all our citizens, not just the truly disadvantaged. And to help do that, we need a new generation of think tanks. We need to follow, for example, Demos and the New American Foundation, which are doing very good work. And I think your work, Policy Bridge, is going in the direction of new think tanks. But we need to have the intellectual basis for a long-term movement. And many of our existing think tanks, I think, are moribund, are not on the cutting edge, and we really have to reassess what a think tank does. Eisenhower Foundation is an example of a hybrid think tank. We do policy reports, but we also fund inner city community groups to do the kinds of programs I'm talking about, and we evaluate. And so when we write a report on policy, we know of what we speak because we're running programs and we're evaluating programs. And I think too many think tanks are too pie-in-the-sky academic. And so there really needs to be a reassessment as part of a new movement about the new generation of think tanks that are necessary for America. Simultaneously, we need to follow the model of Wellstone Action, the organization begun by followers of the great Senator Paul Wellstone. And Wellstone Action is a national organization that identifies and trains local political candidates and gives them the know-how to be successful in running for office, but also trains nonprofit organization leaders in how to organize in between elections so that we don't have to re-gear up again every 2 or 4 years, so that we have a permanent infrastructure politically, just like we should have a permanent intellectual infrastructure that is there and ready, because the conservatives certainly do. And we have to do our best to work on media reform. It's a staggering problem to try to face. The organization Free Press is a good example of a leading nonprofit which is fighting for media reform. If you see how they're fighting for freedom of content on the internet, you know what I'm talking about. But there are many other good models. The Rachel Maddow Show is one of my favorites. The Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. We work with Amy. We need to use the blogosphere, I think, in coming decades, just like the conservatives used talk radio in the past. But we also, I would suggest, need to follow the example of the Guardian newspaper in London. The Guardian is my favorite newspaper. The Guardian has identified a village in Uganda called Katine. And this village is being invested in, social and economic investment. And the Guardian has identified Barclays Bank as the financer and has identified NGOs as the providers of technical assistance, but the poor people in Katini are really doing all the work. So their first achievement was to dig a well, and their second achievement was to build a school. And the Guardian is now sort of stepping aside. It's facilitated the startup of the process and is monitoring it and is writing articles and has his own blog so people can write in and say, oh, this is really stupid, or you should change it. So there's an ongoing debate about how to create social reform in this village in Uganda. I think this is a wonderful model. I've always respected the plain dealer. I would like to challenge the plain dealer. I know times are tough for regional newspapers, but I would like to challenge the plain dealer to consider with Eisenhower the possibility of replicating what the Guardian is doing in Uganda, but doing it in a neighborhood in Cleveland. I think the leadership of a newspaper like this could spread the word around the country. And my hometown, Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel is the same kind of newspaper. It's a regional newspaper with a proud tradition. And so these are some examples of the kind of media reform that are necessary, but so much more needs to be done, including what we do, which is a media school. If you go to the Heritage Foundation, which is the biggest conservative think tank, you see that they have a studio, a television studio, where everyone who works for the Heritage Foundation gets media training. How to, for example, appear on a talk show and make your point 3 times in a certain way and keep on target. Well, how often do inner-city community-based organizations get that kind of media training? Well, they can with Eisenhower because our media trainer, who's an African-American woman who's a former anchor, television anchor, provides media training to inner-city nonprofit leaders. And we bring out a television camera, and each person has to sit and first give a 90-second summary of their organization, and their peers are watching them. So, they get pretty stressed out and sweating, and then we critique them. And then the next step is a friendly interview. Our communications person does a nice interview and asks them decent questions. But then the third round is a Rush Limbaugh type interview and you can imagine our communications person is a liberal African-American woman, and she pretends she's Rush Limbaugh, and she asks really nasty questions. But throughout this process, the inner-city leaders really learn quickly. They're naturals, and they know it. And so why don't we give this kind of media training at the grassroots? It allows these people to get the message out, and that helps in turn to raise money. So these kinds of strategies are certainly all needed, but they all point back to one reality, one basic truth that we have today. President Obama won, but the dream remains deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or, my friends, does it just explode? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a special program with Dr. Alan Curtis of the Eisenhower Foundation. Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests, and holding the microphone today is City Club Outreach Coordinator Deborah Agasti. Now for the first question, please.
So, Mr. Curtis, just one thing I want to get your input on. Since the Kerner Commission came out over 40 years ago, we've had Democrat and Republican senators, congresspeople, whole host of people. And one of my questions is whether or not the political will even exists to allocate the funds necessary to actually meet out these programs that you're speaking about. Because you talked about programs in different pockets of the country, but whether or not, especially in light of the fact that money is being spent over and over and over again right now, that folks are kind of getting to that tipping point perhaps, is there the political will out there, since at least it hasn't existed in the last 40 years in large part, is that political will something that is going to exist and that you foresee happening in the foreseeable future?
Well, that's the question. The political will does not exist right now. The focus is on the middle class. That's the campaign, that's the class that they talked about in the campaign, everyone talked about. The recession made everything worse. So until we get past this recession, which may take 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, I don't think we can really start making progress with many, if not most, of the kinds of reforms I'm talking about, except those that cut across the middle class, working class, and the poor. And that's why I'm saying we need to be careful to have some strategies that do that, because we can get voting majorities for many of those, especially economic, employment, and education reforms that I talked about. Everyone wants to have more scholarships and grants for their kids, for example, rather than loans. And employment is an issue not just in the inner city anymore. So the strategy for the immediate stimulus can begin. But that's where I quoted Rahm Emanuel, let's use this crisis to try to let's solve it, but in the process of solving it, let's use the crisis as a basis for a long-term movement. The Obama people want to do that. I mean, that's why they have this 10 million member email list, and I think they can make progress. Both Obamas, Michelle Obama and Barack Obama, are both talking about a long-term movement, and they're going to try, and I'm talking about trying as well. But it may be that we're in a situation where we can't get really serious about new will until the second Obama term. Hopefully that will occur. But your question is well taken, and the sober, realistic answer is we're not there yet. At least we have someone who gives us some hope, though.
Dr. Curtis, thank you for the update and for your recommendations. And to follow up on observation that you made about the Republican kind of intellectual infrastructure and its noteworthy status, you had also indicated a need to create a similar democratic intellectual infrastructure, more think tanks, if you will. In your view, if you were to provide, an anecdotal rating, a quantification, would you say on a scale of 100 that the Republicans score 85 as far as infrastructure think tanks, and where would the Democrats be in that comparison?
Well, I'd be reluctant to give a score, but I would praise the conservatives for their long-run strategy. And this has been 3 decades in the making, 3 decades plus in the making, and it's well financed. And it did create a lot of think tanks. I'm not sure how much thinking goes on in those think tanks. They're very effective, though, in getting the word out. The Heritage Foundation, for example, is a block from the White House, and it immediately will get a press release out the next day on any issue, and it immediately will have a list of people who are available to talk on Fox the next day. So the apparatus of communicating and propagandizing is well established. They're I would say conservative and progressive rather than Republican and Democrat is pretty close overlap. The progressive think tanks are not many yet. There are a lot of think tanks that are sort of wishy-washy, traditional ones, in my view, that aren't on the cutting edge. And that's why I mentioned new think tanks like Demos and the New America Foundation, which really, I think, have a sense of where we need to go in terms of a long-term movement rather than in just saying, okay, our think tank is composed of people who came back from the last administration, and they'll write their books and give a few speeches, and that'll be it. We need to go far beyond. And some of these new think tanks, for example, understand what I talked about in terms of not only solid ideas, but then getting those ideas out through local grassroots people who are trained in the media, so that you don't have a top-down process where the think tanks tell you, like the Delphic Oracle, what to do, but you have a bubble-up process from the community. So there are probably equal numbers of conservative and progressive think tanks now. The thinking that goes on is questionable, and many of them, the conservative ones, are way ahead in terms of the public relations and communications aspect. And the future is open, including the future of the internet. And whether the blogosphere can be used as a progressive force still remains to be seen, but as I suggested, it has a lot of potential to serve the kind of priorities of the Kerner Commission and the Obama administration, just like talk radio served the priorities of conservatives in the 1980s.
Hi, my name is Peggy Cella. I work for a federally qualified community health center on the near west side of Cleveland. My concern, I understand that we have federal government, and that federal government is coming up with lots of money to try and help change the mess that we're in. I understand that we have state government, and I understand that I'm almost convinced that much of that money, if it comes to the state, will not wind up where it was meant to be. So I'm much more concerned about our local governments. This is a national problem, but it plays out on local levels. And I know that there have been many, many more African American local governmental elected officials, and I know that that they work very hard. But I think we need to be the think tank. I'm not an elected official, but the elected officials need to, I believe, coordinate with local organizations, and I think that we need to become our own think tanks about how to solve some of these problems on a local level and how to garner funds from other sources besides the people we can't depend on. What do you think of that?
Well, I agree. The president I worked for, Jimmy Carter, was not considered that successful as a president. I think he was the best ex-president ever. But he did say that the job of being a mayor is harder than the job of being a president. And I agree with that. And I think Policy Bridge is a good example of local problem solving, or statewide problem solving, maybe, if you expand. And I think that mayors need to work in concert with nonprofit leaders. And in some cities that happens. In some cities there's a lot of stress and tension. But our strategy, the kind of strategy we're promoting, is, as I suggested just a couple seconds ago, it's a bubble-up process. So the more that we can empower, and I'm using this in, I think, a good sense, nonprofits, the more we can fund them, the more we can build the capacity of nonprofits, their board structure, their financial management ability, their ability to raise money, the stronger they'll be in their local neighborhoods. And coalitions of such nonprofits can work with the mayor if the mayor is farsighted enough to understand that the process has to be bubble up from the neighborhoods.
Welcome to Cleveland now, Dr. Curtis.
Thank you.
My name is George Edwards, and I'm the founder and president of the Black Trades Council of Ohio. I have a three-part question for you. One, I'm going to go back in history like you did, whereas African Americans picked the cotton and the tobacco and helped create Wall Street and got unearned income, number one. Number two, in 1869, unions came to America and put those African American masons and carpenters and plumbers out of business and did not allow them to work. Today, in 2009, in the building construction trades, 0.5% of African Americans are in the building construction trades. And I'm looking at the part of the state of Ohio's part of a stimulus package where a great majority of the dollars, what the young lady was saying earlier, are going to be in construction in reference to the roads and the building of the infrastructure, whereas if 0.5% African Americans are not in the unions, what can we really expect from the state of Ohio and that part of the stimulus package that will trickle down to those individuals who are left out and excluded, and want to rise up, want to feed their families, and want to be productive? What is your assessment in reference to that, please?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I'm advocating for stronger unions because of the wage inequality that has been generated over the past 40 years. But you're saying it's not just the government that's at problem, it's the unions. And I don't see myself as an expert in unions, but I do know that the kind of grassroots long-term movement that I'm talking about, that says we need to go to a better place, has to include lobbying and advocacy by African American nonprofit organizations focused on the unions. There are some unions that are more progressive, and I think you've got to build on those as models and then expand. But what you're raising is part of the kind of narrative that I'm talking about, that we have to have a narrative that discusses these issues and that gets not just people in this room, but folks who are watching Fox News more familiar with the priorities of the presidents I discussed and the kind of dilemmas that you're talking about. I don't have a 10-point plan to solve the problem of how to get better African American representation in the unions. But I think this is the time, and this is the president, where you've got to start trying new things, new strategies based on the grassroots.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your comments. I was very pleased to hear you speak about President Obama possibly being in office for 8 years. Since a few days ago, I was listening to CNN, not Fox, and one of the talking heads indicated, perhaps for shock value, that she expected he would be a one-term president. So I'm wondering, in your estimation, what would prevent President Obama, from being a one-term president? What are some of the things that need to happen, or perhaps some of the things that maybe should not happen, and what might those of us who would support a longer term for him, based on our expectations, what might we do?
But I don't even listen to CNN. I listen to MSNBC and Amy Goodman and Rachel Maddow and Jon Stewart. Good question. I think we have to remember that President Obama got elected by the people, and it was a strong statement by people who were dissatisfied with a system that said you're on your own, and that the president is now saying, well, we're in this together. And the current flap you see on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, NBC, is really absurd but not surprising in my mind. It's okay. The president is trying to solve the problem created by the conservatives, but the conservatives are saying, "Stop! You don't want to. You're doing too much." I mean, wait a second. Who got us into this? I mean, part of the narrative is we have to remind America how we got here, and I think if we can do that, if we keep to the emerging longer-term movement, then we have a chance to show that the support the president had in November of 2008 will continue. I think the threat is that he tries hard, and it still is going to take a while to get out of this, and the likes of Ann Coulter will distort things enough so that the polls will start going in another direction, so that we get